Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar that we are launching today with the new report called Stewards of the Regional System, Strengthening the Foundation of Strategic Authorities, which is the fourth report in the series that the FGF has published about impactful devolution. And it's nice for Metrodynamics to be involved in this because we were also involved in the first report, which was published in the summer of 2024, that was setting out an overall framework for devolution. What this report does is offer the opportunity to think about not just what the powers are for strategic authorities, but crucially how they should function, which is something which the white paper and the bill that's going through Parliament is much more quiet about. And so this work has looked at what do we think are the key features of strategic authorities, how should they function, and what sort of ways do they need to work in collaboration with local authorities, now named principal authorities, in their regions. So the report sets out 5 sets of recommendations around core purpose, an emerging form, system delivery for growth, fiscal devolution, improvement and accountability. And we also particularly look at the London system as part of this as well, because London was the first place to have devolution in 1999. And then the next wave of devolution that has happened with mayoral combined authorities is something which then poses questions about how London continues to adapt and is playing a critical role in that devolution process and able to achieve its potential, which is very important for the country as a whole. And it is worth just noting that one of the things that we say in this report is that whilst it's very important to move towards a system of regional government reflected in strategic authorities, that doesn't mean that we don't need regional policy from national government. It's actually very important that strategic authorities are able to operate as part of a system to drive growth and reform, which is connected between local government and national government, and that there is a proper partnership with national government in terms of things like industrial strategy, innovation, growth funding, and infrastructure, and that's channeled through specific arrangements with strategic authorities. So they're some of the things that we're going to be discussing as we go through the report. Let me introduce the panel that we have today. We have Hamida Ali, who is Head of Learning and Practice at the FGF, and Hamida and I were really two of the principal authors of this report. We've got Mark Rogers, who's the Interim Chief Officer of Sussex and Brighton and County Combined Authority, but also, if you don't mind me saying so, Mark, somewhat of a veteran when it comes to establishing combined authorities, having been there at the outset of the West Midlands, and then setting up the East Midlands Combined Authority, and also with experience in Hull and Humber. Tom Walker, who is the Interim Chief Officer for the Greater Essex County Combined Authority, who is a gamekeeper turned poacher, because he was originally in government in a variety of senior positions, including oversight of the white paper on levelling up, much of which set the framework that we're working on today. And then just to say that Ali Griffin has unfortunately been called away, and so won't be able to take part in the discussion today, but we're delighted to have Yolanda Burgess, the Strategy Director for Communities and Public Service Reform from London Councils, to talk about the London perspective on this work. So Hamida, can I ask you to introduce the report and set out the research we went through, some of the kind of overarching findings that we came to, and then we'll get into a discussion with the panel. And after we've done that, there'll be the opportunity to take questions from all of you who've are taking part in this webinar today. And there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen that enables you to put in a question. And I'll do my very best to ensure that we get round to answering as many of those questions as we can. Just to also say that this session is being recorded and will be put out by the Future Governance Forum through YouTube and other channels in the next few days. So Hamida, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Great to be able to set out some of what we found. In terms of how we went about the research, we spoke to around 100 people in one way or another, and we're really grateful to London Council's colleagues for access to a number of their networks for those conversations. We also spoke to a number of colleagues working in and around local, regional, and national government, and we're grateful to all of those colleagues for the time that they spared to share their insight with us. Overall, and enshrined in the title for the report, the importance of the stewardship role as we saw it for strategic authorities came through in many of those conversations. And we set out our thoughts on some principles for that stewardship role and what we describe as a blended model, which I'll come back to. First, perhaps to touch on four key areas, which Ben has already highlighted based on our reflections of the development of English devolution from the GLA, as Ben highlighted, onwards. The first of those was sort of core purpose, that while the first strategic authorities were very explicitly driven by economic development, over time that mission has gradually broadened, and which now the draft bill, of course, codifies in much wider terms. And our conversations reflected that that broadening is both important and welcome, but at the same time a challenge. Secondly, around system delivery, here we're highlighting some of the challenges that perhaps relate to the how as opposed to the what around that purpose, particularly for much newer strategic authorities. So challenges of around both capacity and capability were raised. Capacity full stop, inevitably, for some of those authorities establishing themselves with very small numbers of staff in the first instance, but also of specialist capabilities, for example, around finance and treasury, around land assembly and compulsory purchase. And we heard that not only are those skills in quite short supply, but clearly as more strategic authorities and indeed mayoral development corporations come on stream, the competition for that small pool further intensifies. And connected to that sort of challenge of the how, collaboration came through as very clearly of fundamental importance, with strategic authorities playing a key role to set and sustain a genuinely collaborative culture in the interest of leveraging the sort of greater than the sum of its parts. And that legislation alone and a constitution for a combined authority don't in themselves create trusting and committed relationships, and how important it is that there is work to be done there in itself, particularly where there's perhaps no history, particularly in some of the newer regions coming on stream of collaborative working. Thirdly, fiscal devolution inevitably was raised, and that the promise of strategic authorities might perhaps only be realised if a set of ever-growing responsibilities isn't matched better with greater fiscal flexibility. And there were two key elements that we cover in the report in this regard. One on integrated settlements, so that the rules around these should be relaxed further so that they are perhaps genuinely as flexible as advertised, but also that perhaps they could go much further. Both the Future Governance Forum and Metro Dynamics are fans of a total place approach to public service budgeting, and we toy with the idea of what a regional approach to pooled resources through a total place settlement might look like. And the other area around fiscal devolution was around more opportunities for strategic authorities to both retain and raise revenue beyond the visitor levy that, of course, was announced in the budget. That government could go further with powers to raise more revenue or retain the proceeds of growth through land value capture. And we also point to the French model, where 1% of national insurance is ring fenced and then reinvested in regional infrastructure. And then fourthly, the area, before coming back to this idea of regional stewardship, I wanted to raise was around improvement and accountability, both of which we heard are either missing or lacking in the current arrangements. There's no formal structured approach to improvement within the sector, and the fact that 3 out of 14 combined authorities have either had or are subject to a best value notice is perhaps instructive. And we also heard that in terms of scrutiny, strategic authorities could learn from practice in local government, and we explore a little the prospects of a regional public accounts model and what that could offer, and how bringing politicians from across chambers, both councillors and members of parliament, what that could offer in the interest of good scrutiny. And then finally, I wanted to come back to this idea of stewardship. We offer 5 principles of what that stewardship role could look like. And that draws on some conversations that we had during the research on what we've called a blended model of governance, which seeks to perhaps learn from both ends of the spectrum of the evolution of devolution, where it combines the clarity and authority of the mayoral role together with the collaborative governance of bringing local authorities in that combined authority to bear collectively. So amongst those 5 principles, one was the facilitating and setting of regional missions, so enabling that collective agreement. Secondly, around then mobilising both local government and partners across all sectors behind those shared missions, really using their scale to convene and to leverage again the collective impact of all of that effort. Thirdly is around as a regional strategic commissioner, that strategic authorities can bring greater coherence to service delivery, particularly around employment support is a good example, but also thinking about the 10-year health plan. What could that mean in terms of strategic authorities as a commissioner in terms of health and what that might mean for better outcomes? Fourthly, around partnering with local government, where strategic authorities can both lean into their convening role, but also deploy their particular scale and capability to support around particular service areas. And then fifthly, this dynamic model, perhaps, that we point to, where both strategic authorities and local authorities use their symbiotic relationship, kind of moving into the lead and into support role according to the policy area. So if it's an area around homelessness, for example, where local authorities could be taking the lead, but equally where it's a strategic priority around growth, local authorities are perhaps supporting in relation to the strategic authority. And perhaps finally to say, we felt that perhaps the longer lead-in time to mayoral elections perhaps offers a useful period of time to really give the opportunity to prepare in the context of some of what we've considered for the reality and practice of the new roles that are envisaged for strategic authorities. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Hamida. Mark, if I could turn to you, it'd be really great to hear your reflections initially on the report, and thank you also for having been involved in some of the early discussions about this as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Hamida. So 3 initial reflections from me. So firstly, I really welcome that this report signals the importance of broader purpose. I think for a long time, I've kind of thought that the framing of inclusive growth, for example, is a really helpful one because it allows these regional bodies to be thinking about social, economic, environmental, and other considerations. So I really like that that's almost where you start with this, really kind of talking about the fact that there is a broader purpose than that which is simply defined in legislation. So I think that's really important. I like it for a second reason, which is mayors and combined authorities have lots of powers between them, but the greatest is when they combine to convene, and to convene about things that really, really matter to places. So very much pleased with that. I think secondly, I like the focus on the need for a kind of grown-up, mature partnership between Westminster government and regional government. These are not outposts of Westminster and Whitehall, but nor actually are they outposts of local government either. They are new forms of regional government and governance, and they deserve the respect of a relationship with Westminster as well as with their principal authorities that's built on the notions of parity and equity. So very much support that focus in the report. And then you would expect me to kind of pick this bit out, wouldn't you? Because it's of particular interest to me. But the blended model that the report refers to, I think, is really important. And just to say about that the opportunity to get the dynamics optimized between mayoral leadership and wider collaborative policy making and decision making, it is just a fantastic, exciting, interesting opportunity to kind of work with. And if we truly understand, I think, what the phrase combined authority means, it is not combination in the sense of integrating various kind of parts. What it is the bringing together of authorities to get things done together. And I really think the report helps bring that meaning out, rather than the kind of false understanding that we're somehow bringing organisations together and collapsing them into a new thing.
Thanks for that, Mark. Tom, you've seen this both from in government, where you've been helping to set up combined authorities, and now you are actually helping to set up a combined authority in a place in Essex. So what are your reflections on the report?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Hamida, for the overview. I mean, firstly, welcome the report, and it's good to have these sorts of inputs from you and other organisations, which, for reasons I'll briefly cover, Ben, in response to your question, you get very drawn into the setup of a combined authority rather than where might we want to be at the end of the mayor's first term and beyond. And obviously we can follow in the footsteps of authorities and places that are much further ahead. So welcome the report. I think all of the findings are relevant to Essex, Greater Essex, including actually the London one, because the prize we are after, or one of the prizes, is a different sort of relationship between Greater Essex and the GLA and the London mayoralty, and that particularly matters for geographies like the Thames Estuary. I mean, just by way of comments for people who may be less familiar with Greater Essex, sort of what is it and size, scale. So a combined authority that would be formed of the large county council, that's where I worked for 3.5 years, and then 2 medium-sized unitaries, Thurrock and Southend, and a population of pushing 1.9 million and a very significant economy, but also socio inequality and disadvantage, often quite marked by the aggregate statistics in Greater Essex. So that's context. And Ben, just briefly to sort of respond to your question and the experience. I mean, the things that for the stage we're at, which is on the devolution priority programme, really jump out and resonate. And I say this for colleagues in other areas who might not be as far as advanced as us, is the importance of the relationship based approach, and echoing Mark, that's within. So we've had to work really hard to kind of get over that sense that, well, is this an agenda where the county dominates the unitaries because they're not equal sized, and vice versa? Is it the 2 unitaries can sort of club together against the county? All of that dynamic needs to be worked through. And in practical terms, we've done that with a set of work streams shared and led by each authority. It's sort of it's not rocket science, but it's really, really important. The other comment, just briefly on the relationships, and again, it's to the blended model point. I say this often, you know, I'm the last defender of the old deals-based approach, because what the deals-based approach did bake in was a less transactional arrangement. You sort of had to get to know the place. The strength of the framework that we have and the legal footing is obvious, it's consistent, but I think it has meant the last year has been a bit sort of in the detail of signing off the statutory instrument, rather than the bigger question which Mark alludes to, which is how do we really unlock economic opportunity in a powerful economy like Greater Essex? So it's the report really echoes that, but I'll draw those opening statements, Ben, to a close and pick up themes that you want to press on. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And Yolanda, can I just ask you to sort of reflect a bit on what we say about London in the report, in terms, because we highlight some of the sort of new challenges and the fact that you know that the GLA itself was created to respond to an economic analysis of London in the 1990s, which is very different from the reality of London now.
Definitely. Thank you, Ben, and also thank you, Hamida. I'm reflecting on not just the report and some of the comments that Ben, you and Hamida have made, but also some of what Mark and Tom have just said. So Mark, you really lent into how the report draws out the systems leadership elements of strategic authorities, not just convening, but like leading, but also partnerships, and actually how we need to help think about strategic authorities in that kind of like not just leadership, but followership. Tom, you talked about then relationships beyond strategic authorities, so how strategic authorities relate to other strategic authorities. And what that's made me reflect on even more is what a strategic authority for London has to look like, because London isn't just a capital city, it's a global city. So what that actually means in terms of convening partnerships, trusted partners. We've each commented on the relationship with national, and actually how do strategic authorities, particularly strategic authorities which have been evolving over many years, and that isn't just London, I think we get into a different conversation with national government about how we help national government to shift its thinking. And I think that's a critical thing for me. But also, and obviously I would say this because I'm local government, but devolution can't be the handing of power and money from one set of bureaucrats to another. This genuinely has to be around how do powers and controls sit closer to people who live in our places, which oddly takes me to the fiscal devolution point, because actually fiscal devolution does have to be a much more serious element of devolution, because strategic authorities have to be serious investors in their place. And it's actually how do they create those right investment vehicles, working with partners and partnerships. And again, thinking from a London perspective, that also is about how we operate as a global city as well. So even outside of the comments that are made directly about London, I think the points, Ben, Hamida, that you've drawn out in those kind of 5 specific areas are genuinely interesting to London, but almost seeing them through a slightly different lens. Like I say, that kind of not just capital city, but global city. And how do we learn from the existing other strategic authorities, but also how do we then share and also talk to government about some of the powers that London has? Those are the powers that other strategic authorities need to have as well.
Thank you, Yolanda. And Mark, I was just building in a way on what Yolanda said. One of the things that's striking is that the process of establishing combined authorities, now strategic authorities, was started off as a kind of organic process and a deal-based process. It's now been more formalised in a structure that we see in a bill and in the white paper. But it's different from the system that was designed for London in that not as much thought has been put into the institutional structure and capacity that strategic authorities will need to have in order to deliver against their 7 functions. So I suppose a question, and obviously part of that points you towards needing to collaborate more as a system. But I'm just curious, from your perspective, having been involved in setting up different strategic authorities, how do you think you can address that question of how you have the competence across the system to deliver against those 7 areas of responsibility?
So it's a really good question, isn't it? So I think where I start with this is there just needs to be that really good understanding of the nature of the place or the places that these authorities are being set up to drive, drive growth for sure, but kind of drive other particularly relevant kind of regional and I guess sometimes national agendas. So actually, I'm quite a fan of a tight, loose arrangement here. I'm not looking for a handbook. I'm not looking for detailed guidance on how to set things up and how to ensure all of those competencies are kind of properly reflected in organisation structures. I'm much more interested in the processes that need to take place in relation to understanding the needs and opportunities of a place, how you build the coalitions around those needs and opportunities in order to get decisions made around priorities for investment, opportunities for transformation. And I think, so one of the observations I have about the kind of wider environment with all of this is I think I'm in general terms a supporter of the English Devolution and Community Engagement Bill. But what I don't really want it to do is go much further. I'm very happy to have some kind of, whatever, pegs in the ground, something like that. But for me, this regional level of government and governance is all about having sufficient flexibility to be responsive both to the national challenges that we're facing, but also then lean in absolutely to the regional kind of needs of business and communities there. So I'm not sure whether that comprehensively answers your question. But I'm trying to kind of give a strong sense for me about retaining enough license in order to be able to respond to the requirements and opportunities of a local area, and not being kind of straitjacketed into a form of kind of building one of these things that really just makes them all look the same.
Thanks for that. And Tom, one of the things that I think you were talking about, the importance of being focused on what it is you're trying to achieve. What's the prize that you collectively identify makes this collaboration worthwhile, and that one of the kind of aspects of the deal-based system was it kind of forced you to have to engage with that at an earlier phase. So I've just kind of been interested a bit more in how do you think you can collectively develop that sense of what the prize is. And then aligned with that, I suppose, is a question about the skill sets that are required. So it's noticeable that the strategic authorities are having to staff up rightly because they're growing as organisations, and it's since we had regional development agencies, it's quite a long period of time, and a lot of people retired. So we're having to create new areas of skill, and they're not exactly the same as the skill that people would necessarily have having worked in a Whitehall department. They might have some of those skills, but it doesn't follow they would, or even always that they would have those skills if they just worked in local government. It might be a mixture of some of those skills. So I'm just wondering, what do you see as being the sort of both the way in which you form this kind of collaboration around economic objectives, and what are the skill sets that will be required for that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question, but how we were thinking about it in Greater Essex, and obviously we're all working through the detail of the change of election date. So a few thoughts. First one is, obviously a place like Greater Essex, we are following on from what others have done, including what happens when a mayor arrives. And what we were trying to calibrate is enough preparation and enough of a core team to work with mayoral candidates. But on the outcomes, the clue is in the title combined authority. It's the three, in our case, three leaders and the mayor. So we were all about being ready rather than pre-cooking outcomes or projects or priorities. And obviously, in my role as the interim CEO, was hoping to work with the mayoral candidates. So we were clear what they would prioritise, and they were clear that they were coming into a new formative organisation, and the first year would be transition. So I put a lot of store actually on the political process and the mayors themselves defining that set of early priorities, obviously on advice from the constituent authority leaders and the staff team that I would have been heading. On skills, I mean, the risk, Ben, my answer sounds a bit trite, but I think that you can't substitute the sort of evidence base. And in a place like Greater Essex, we have it, but it's disparate. Bits have been refreshed, but there's quite a comprehensive need to use and refresh the whole evidence base that's needed for the spatial development strategy, as well as local growth plan. I think there is a sort of interesting thing. It's almost like imagination. Where do you get imagination from? And that revolves, I think, around the convening role and that sense of excitement of a new organisation. Because you can have conversations which are different. Clearly, there would be some resource that transfers across from constituent authorities, but it's an exciting project. Private sector partners are curious. We've already got the Thames Estuary Board. It's going through a transition. We've got others involved. So there's something about sort of pooling in and using imagination, sense of excitement, new political office, which if I hark back to being 25 years younger and the mayor arriving in Greater London, there was that sense as a London resident. And then I think the other thing that was most, not exercising me, but I was keen to develop as quickly as possible, is how to use the public pound for maximum impact and leverage, which is a different set of financial skills. Obviously, I've worked in Homes England, and sort of in simple terms, how can you have the kind of Homes England nous on investment in combined authority so that you don't end up just sort of spending the investment fund on nice to have projects, which are necessary, don't get me wrong, but you're actually building with the National Wealth Fund, with Homes England, a way of using that money. So that finance skill set, I think, is the one I was most interested in. I don't have an answer, but I know from Homes England what is possible, how to sort of get that in early doors rather than a sort of local authority financial administration approach to the budget, which of course is necessary, but you've got to build on that. So a few thoughts there, Ben.
Thanks, Tom. And Yolanda, just going back to what you were saying about London. I mean, London's obviously developed. It was the first place in England to have devolution to a city, and it has developed some really powerful institutions like TfL, for example, which is a huge, it's not just a transport body, it's an economic development organisation. But thinking about the challenges London now faces, what do you think are the lessons that it could learn from what you've seen with strategic authorities around the country about how it deals with a new set of challenges, for example, around housing?
Thanks, Ben. Actually, just thinking about what, your question you asked Tom around sort of like skills and capability, there's the danger of people assuming that the capacity and capability already exists in London, because we've got things like, you mentioned TfL, huge, brilliant, fantastic. But the capacity and capability that we have today is unlikely to be the capacity and capability that we need tomorrow. I think we're grappling with that already. You mentioned housing. The housing context has changed so drastically that we're already doing, the boroughs working with GLA, the Mayor's Office, and with national government as well, to think about what are the different ways that we can look at developing, to use a phrase in a slightly odd way, almost like what the partnership investable proposition looks like to get into a different space to solve the housing problem, which isn't about the usual suspects. That's where, how are we talking to partners in a different way? The National Health Service has got enormous capital assets. Do we need to work with them to talk to Treasury about how we're unlocking some of those sorts of things, right through to social investment, how we're working with private partners, very much leaning into, I think, what Tom was saying about imagination. What does real innovation and what do different models look like? So I think for me, the learning for London is, don't assume that we've got it all sorted. We almost need to think about, it's great, we've got these capacity and capability now, but what does the new capacity and capability need to look like, and how are we getting ready for that? I think also, because we're all trying to get ourselves into some space for, and genuinely is, I think we need to make sure that we're clear that strategic authorities, as we're discussing them now, aren't what we've got now. They shouldn't be. Let's also make sure that there is some collective thinking across our development of strategic authorities. So we're not all pitching in the same fishing pond. Actually, how can we jointly build some of that future capacity and capability together? How are we using it? How are we learning together? And almost create a learning system across our strategic authorities. Again, thinking about how we need strategic authorities to work across strategic authorities as well. I think from a London perspective, that's where we need to make sure that we are humble and generous about the fact that we have things like TfL. So how are we sharing some of that learning? How are other developments that sit within the GLA and the GLA family how can we provide some of that learning? But equally, how can we also provide learning from how London local authorities have grown, developed and matured their relationships with not just the GLA and the Mayor's Office, but the whole GLA family, Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime. You've already mentioned TfL, Violence Reduction Unit. Again, how do we share some of that learning, but think about how those things grow and mature as we develop a new sense of strategic authority for London, but also has strategic authorities develop across the country.
So I'm now going to turn to some of the questions that have been put in the chat. One of the questions I think is a really important one is about how do we make the existence of strategic authorities and regional government mean that we can lever in, as it were, more investment to the UK as a whole, rather than getting into a sort of competitive game between places. And so how can that enable almost like a system of regions working together, thinking about what their particular specialisms are, how that can boost investment in one place? Is there a case for some, but either, what's the role of government in working with places, as Mark and others talked about, in terms of creating that partnership? Is there also a case for pan-regional working? In the North, for example, the Great North are working together as a set of combined authorities to think about the overall northern investment proposition. There's a Midlands compact between the two mayors in the Midlands. So I just wonder, how do you think it makes most sense to address that critical question, which one of the drivers for devolution, not the only one, is about regional economic balance. How do we grow the economy as a whole by allowing our places to grow, but not in a way that is sort of taking growth from each other? So who would like to have a go at that question first?
I'm happy, Ben.
Okay.
Do you want me to jump into that? I'll try and be brief so others can build on it. I mean, I think there is a sort of core plan. So I'm looking at the notes I scribbled down, or a core set of ingredients. Like, stability is really important for investment, and what do I mean by stability? Reliable decision making, long-term plans. So I do think the spatial development strategy is a really, really important part of that, alongside local growth plan, and then that turns into an infrastructure pipeline, because ultimately all my experience on the government side of this is you want to deal with places that you can do business with, whether public to public or commercial investment. So I think those core ingredients are important, and I do think the combined authority model with a mayor makes those conditions more rather than less likely. I mean, the mayors are really important, and there's obviously a bit of frustration about the delay in having the elected official, the person who is rung up, the person who can take the call, make the decision, etc. The mayoral feature, I think, is really important, and we're going to take a little bit longer to get there in the Essex context. So the core ingredients, I think, are well understood, and the conditions are pretty favourable. Two final points. One, I think areas where areas can exercise discipline that admits that they're not leaders on all 8 of the industrial strategy areas helps then DBT, the business department, engage in a realistic way. So of course there'll be competition, but a bit of humility about where the genuine strengths are actually makes it easier to do business with government. And then the final thing, we were excited about Pan East region, so Cambridge, Peterborough Mayor, Norfolk, Suffolk Mayor and Essex Mayor working together. We have Transport East as an informal statutory, sorry, it's not statutory transport body, but the regional transport body. And we were looking, and hopefully we'll still work towards that sort of arrangement, because I think we also have to be humble. There are some things that should just be done at that bigger scale for the sort of impact that the country as a whole needs. So that covers some of the territory. I'll let Mark or Yolande jump in.
Thanks, Tom. Ben, I'm just reflecting on the fact that your report with Hamida really kind of leans into that broadening of the core purpose of strategic authorities. And for me, that's the opportunity to join up growth and reform So we're not seeing them as separate, that we're not giving them separate identities. That's where those conversations about inclusive growth, I think, become far more important. Strategic authority to a strategic authority as well. So we're actually, again, we're not just shifting the walls. We're actually genuinely thinking about not just in terms of economic corridors, but what does that actually mean for somebody's life in terms of their ability to access the benefits of growth and those kinds of things, as well as then thinking about what the opportunities for inclusive growth around shifting much more into a preventative agenda, public service reform, etc. So I think that broadening of the core purpose of strategic authorities frees up the opportunities to bring those agendas together and look at growth, I would say, from a more human lens.
Okay, thank you. Mark, did you want to come back?
I'll be brief. So I think some of this is back to kind of the nature of partnership working with government. So I think some of my experience suggests that it's absolutely right, both nationally and regionally, for government and mayors to sort of curate a set of kind of strategic, going to use the phrase, investable propositions. I think that is exactly right. That's kind of what we're trying to do here, isn't it? It's kind of make sure that we kind of got that equity across the country of balancing big national infrastructure kind of stuff with really well understood needs of regions that will help kind of drive the growth piece here. But I think what we're seeing is kind of an increasing tendency for the regions to think about collaborating around interregional work. I think what we probably need to see more of is greater collaboration with government through the national industrial strategy, so that we reduce the competition. Actually, I guess. And then the second thing I guess I would say is the advent of the national investment summits held regionally, so London, then Birmingham, and then heading north for the third. I think if we do the thing that I've just described beforehand, which is some kind of much better coordination of national and regional significant sort of investment opportunity, it brings a much more orchestrated approach to how we talk to the market when we're seeking foreign direct investment. And to Tom's earlier point, we've got relatively small, they look good, don't you, when you kind of aggregate them up, but the investment funds, they only go so far. The purpose of them is not of themselves, is it? It's the leverage that they bring. So I kind of think that the two things I've said around much more coordination around what should be invested in and much more agreement nationally and regionally about what that looks like, along with a really strong facilitated approach to how we then draw in investment and look credible from in the 5-minute kind of carousel of chats that you have between regions and investors, is what we need to do.
And there's a question in the chat about Homes England, but I think it could be broadened to some of the other government agencies, OFI, National Wealth Fund as well. And that question of how should these organisations work with devolved authorities, with strategic authorities. And an observation has been, there's been sometimes a bit of a danger in the past that we've had this kind of weird paradox that because of austerity, a lot of capacity has been stripped out of the local government system. It's therefore been difficult to develop investable pipelines of projects. And then new money, and as well as private investment, is waiting to find places it can invest in. And then the organisations that reflect that sit in judgment on the lack of quality of the pipelines that have been developed. When surely what would make sense, and I think we are seeing more of, as you said, Mark, with that kind of partnership working through the investment summit, is for arm's length bodies to work hand in hand with strategic authorities. Perhaps even to devolve some of their functions or teams to work directly in with strategic authorities. So I wonder again what your kind of reflections are on that. Do you think that's gone far enough? And Tom, I'm going to ask you, as someone who used to be a senior figure at Homes England, how does that feel like it's working at the moment? Tom, you're muted.
But I thought you were going to go to Mark first, but I will. Sorry, let me answer. It is So all the direction to me looks right, and the new refreshed Homes England strategy, the regional model, and I think it's entirely right. And particularly when you get to the scale of strategic authority we're talking about, that means it's a manageable number of places across the country. I think that's really important. So direction, good. In Essex as it stands, we've got a number of garden communities and big beneficiaries of the Homes England Housing Infrastructure Fund, announced several years ago, and projects now delivering. We've definitely noticed a shift from what felt like quite a standoff, use it or lose it, we're holding your feet to the fire relationship, project by project, to how, using the language I used earlier, how do we make the public pound go as far as possible in what are still quite volatile market conditions. So I think that relationship has shifted. I can only speak for a sort of emergent combined authority area. I think the next stage, and some of this is incumbent on us, is actually to develop our pipeline and to be able to make some trade-offs locally, and then get into the relationship with Homes England that mayoral devolution offers. We wouldn't be ready to take wholesale the functions of Homes England, and they've got some very specialist skills, particularly on the investment side, which I think do benefit from being national. They've just got to be national, answering to a local imperative, ideally set by mayors, and mayors who command the confidence of local leaders. So there's a bit of a journey to go on, but I think the mood music actually is pretty good on that. So there you are. Over to Mark, or back to you, Ben.
Yeah, and Mark, would you like to sort of pick up on that as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in. So Tom alluded to this kind of quite early on in, I think, his opening remarks about thinking very carefully about what it means to be a regional investment vehicle, if you like, or a regional investment body. So I do agree with what Tom said. I think what is going through our minds now in Sussex and Brighton, and it kind of went through them to a lesser extent in the two previous places I've recently been in, because this is that's kind of classic journey that we're on about, kind of understanding more and more, isn't it? But one of the things I'm understanding more and more is that there are some very profound questions about what functionality the combined authority should have, as opposed to what convening of capabilities it might actually orchestrate. So, I mean, some of this is most definitely me speaking rather than me speaking on behalf of places I'm in or been in recently. But I am thinking hard along with colleagues about what are the capabilities that you need to assemble, but in relation to actually what is the role of the combined authority in investment. Because, I can think, there are some very significant pieces of investment which I think should quite happily continue to be delivered either locally or nationally. I don't want to kind of create an assumption that everything kind of gets sucked up to the down or up to the regional level. So there are some things that we just really don't need to do, and therefore there'll be some capabilities that we don't need to have, but there'll be others about orchestrating investment that we very much need to have, that feel to me like public-private arrangements. I'm not going to go so far as to say kind of public-private partnerships or particular vehicles, but as I think about investment capability and what it is that the authority might require in that space, I can't but think about how we work with, sovereign wealth funds, other big, the pension funds, for example, which are all being encouraged to kind of do business with. There's something very important, I think, to think about here, because we might just be the means of investment coming to fruition, rather than them being the organisation that delivers the direct result of that investment. We just bask in the kind of reflected glory of it all when it goes well. But I do think there's plenty to think about there, rather than simply assuming let's build an investment function. Let's have people who can do X, Y, and Z because that's what they did in a council, or that's what they do somewhere else. Yeah.
So we just need the capability in the system. It doesn't have to be in the particular institution.
That would be my view at the moment. I'm not sure how widely held or popular that is.
And so we spent a bit of time talking about growth and investment, and Yolanda, you rightly were talking about the broadening purpose that we've reflected for combined authorities, and we've had a question about that in relation to public service reform, and it wouldn't be a devolution and local government discussion if the term coterminosity didn't come up in conversation. And so, as is often the case, we found ourselves with a very clear framework of an emerging structure for strategic authorities, and then we have the publication of a 10-year health strategy and the merger of some ICBs, and now only last week, or maybe even this week, I've lost track of when it was, there was the announcement of potential police structural reform. So I'm going to come to you first on this, Yolanda, and then to Mark and Tom. What's your view about, given that public service reform is such an important part of what it feels like needs to be taken forward at a strategic authority and a system level, how does it work with other bits of the system when those systems themselves are changing?
Oh, the joy of footprints. I think sometimes when we start having conversations about coterminosity, we just get dragged into process and structures. And actually, what I've found helpful about this discussion is we've been talking about relationships and how relationships work. And I think that's the important bit to stick with, to stay with. There is also, particularly when we're thinking about, the conversation that was just had, with Tom and Mark were contributing to, around how, let's not think about who has a specific power or responsibility, but where is the best place for that power or responsibility to sit. I think requires more thinking on some of the principles that we need larger organisations to work on. Strategic authority, the secret's in the name. If you want to be strategic, you have to be able to plan long term. So if you've got national organisations not just holding your feet to the fire about delivering something, but delivering it within a specific financial year, how can you be strategic? So rather than get into, we need to think about coterminosity and making footprints the same, is actually, how do we work with a differently structured NHS? How do we support our ability to be strategic in our thinking? How do we create the conditions to do that? And very much thinking about this from a local perspective, ensuring that the conditions that people are thinking about come to the point of why we're doing this. It's about improving outcomes. It's about improving people's lives. And so how do all the conditions come together for everybody, irrespective of what their footprint looks like? There will always be practical things that we have to figure out in that space. But in a sense, with the NHS changes, as you've just rightly pointed out, the new police changes, all of those things are happening now. So let's have those discussions now together.
Thanks. And Mark, do you agree? Is it nimble footwork rather than a uniform footprint that we need?
Well, so I was just kind of reflecting on the fact that this messiness has existed the entire time I've been working in public services. So whilst I'll still harbour an ambition for some kind of greater, whatever coterminosity is, and we're seeing mayors argue hard and fast for that now. They were doing it over the new ICB footprints. They're going to do it over the police ones next, aren't they? And I appreciate why they might want to do that. But you know what, Ben? Coterminosity is only as strong as the relationships that sit behind it. And therefore, if you haven't got coterminosity, you still carry on investing in the relationships and work it out. I think I don't know, maybe this is too broad a brush statement to say, but I'll say it anyway. We often resort to the technical, I think, in English government at the considerable expense of the adaptive. We stop thinking about the importance of relationships, why we need them, how we develop them, what to do when there's difference. And we resort to kind of technical answers around what to do when there's difference, like, shall we judicially review you then, or whatever. When actually it seems to me, it's a much more conducive environment to doing business when you've got a set of relationships that, even when there's friction in them, because nobody's going to love each other all of the time, but that you're working on that as your premise for how you build collaboration and how you have a presumption of being inclusive in your work, and collaborative in your decision making. So if we do place-based budgeting from the kind of like, the old starting point of total place, which is like how much money is in the area, then frankly we'll end up where total place ended up, albeit prematurely ended in 2010, which is arguing about the numbers, not about the outcomes and how we might get to a process of collaborating on outcomes.
Tom, what's your view about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably going to use very similar words and actually describe similar thing. I mean, in the Essex context, I mean, it's quite prosaic, right? The chief constable sits around the leaders and chief executives table. And if you take concrete things that we've worked on together, suicide prevention is one. It's a very big problem issue. It's necessarily multi-agency, and the boundaries don't really drive things. We are coterminous with the police and fire commissioner at the moment. And another would be the work on violence against women and girls. The boundary conversation is largely irrelevant. Having said that, we have moved to a single integrated care board that maps onto the devolution and current police geography, and that will be very welcome. I think because principally it will make it a bit easier. It's sort of no more than that. So you end up back where Mark and Yolanda said, strength of relationship and clarity of purpose. What are the things that you most want to impact that require multi-agency work? The world is complex, so it's always going to be a feature. And we haven't talked happily for once about LGR very much in this. I mean, we are going through an enormous rewiring of the local government system. And I think the almost universal view is that unitary local government in a place like Essex, moving away from 12 districts to unitaries in a big county, will, it's not a coterminous thing, but it will make it much, much simpler to drive priorities. We've just got 2 years now to work through it and not take our eye off the ball.
Okay, thanks very much. And I'm conscious actually that we are drawing to a close. And in a way, it feels appropriate that we've come back to the beginning of the conversation, which is why purpose is so important. Because that really should be the driving force behind any forms of governance that are created at a regional level. And agreeing that common purpose, which is broader than just, as it were, traditional economic growth to growth that's also inclusive growth, as Yolanda was saying, is critically about building a common understanding amongst colleagues across the system and at every level in the system about what it is we're trying to achieve. And then you can create the institutions that can deliver that for you and build the capabilities. But what is really critical is for that shared understanding across the system. And I'm struck with, I did was part of a webinar yesterday with the Health Foundation, where one of the people taking part, Warren Heppelet, who is now the director of the prevention demonstrator in GM, was, as it were, tracking the evolution of his position, going back sort of 15 years to 20 years to how growth and reform were always seen to be two sides of the same coin in their thinking, because you can't address economic growth unless you can also address the things that are stopping people from being able to work. So all of this stuff is actually what we were trying to achieve through strategic authorities. And so thank you very much for taking part. Thanks everyone for joining. The report, which is published today, is available from all good websites, particularly the Future Governance Forums and, I should say, Metrodynamics. And please read it, and let's all continue to be part of this evolving discussion, because it does feel to me, at a time when we don't always take the greatest satisfaction from what happens in national politics, that one of the real sort of rays of light in our system is the innovation and new sort of hope that is being driven by what we're seeing through devolution across the country. So thanks everyone for joining, and thanks in particular for the panelists.